I'm Katie Fallon. My name is Katie Fallon. I went to Princeton University and my circumnavigation was in 2008. The New York chapter of the club sponsored my trip. Yeah, so my research topic looked at what the impact of land regularization policies was around the world. So I was looking at informal communities and a swath of countries and what their policies were to give ownership to people, ranging from Guatemala City and Guatemala, where there were absolutely no policies that formalized the land holdings for those in informal dwellings, to places like India and South Africa, where there had been pretty extensive policies put in place to give people ownership over their land. Yeah, so I'm from New York City, and growing up, the two most formative pieces of my life were actually around sort of homelessness and insecure housing. When I was little, my dad took me into Manhattan to see a play, and he likes to tell the story. On the way back from Broadway to Penn Station, where we were about to commute, there was a man who was sitting in a box and his head was bleeding. And it was the first time that I had ever experienced somebody living outside generally, not having a house, not having a home. And being 4 years old, that was like really impactful. I still remember that moment, and talking to my dad about why this person didn't have a home. And he didn't have a great explanation, because it's very hard to explain to a child why somebody needs to live outside. And the second experience that I think really impacted me was I went to a progressive school, and a lot of the work that we did was focused outside the US. So it had a very global impact. And one of the projects that we did was on Haiti. And it talked a lot about informal housing in Haiti. So the fact that people were living in shanty towns and slums. And part of our work was to donate money so that individuals who were living in non-standard housing could upgrade their homes. And so I think just being exposed to that as a child, and the fact that people are living in all sorts of different types of dwellings, many of which are substandard in the way that we think about it, not hooked up to water, don't have secure roofs, don't have toilets, don't have TVs, really shaped the way that I looked at housing and the way that I understood housing security. And so I carried that through me with college. And as I started to learn a little bit more about housing generally, wanted to really focus on that piece of housing. When I enrolled in Princeton, I knew I wanted to work in public policy. I initially thought that I would be looking at education policy, but took a few classes on education policy and realized that was just not where my passion lay. But I did find out that I was really passionate about housing policy. And in the United States, housing policy is pretty cut and dry. We mostly have formal housing where you own your property and you live within that property, but that is actually changing now pretty rapidly. But one of the things that I was exposed to when I lived internationally or abroad for a little while was informal housing. So the idea that people are living informally and don't have ownership over their house. And while I was taking classes in the Woodrow Wilson School, which is now just the School of Public Policy and International Affairs, a number of economics classes that I was taking talked about the fact that those individuals who don't own their properties can't mortgage their homes or use that home in any way to leverage it or build collateral or economic output for themselves. And so I started researching that and got really interested in slum and informal housing, and wanted to just better understand what that looks like around the world, how it impacts people's lives, and whether or not policies that were being implemented to actually give people ownership of their land improved their lives, and if so, how it improved their lives. And so that was what I applied to the Circumnavigators Foundation to research, and I was really just hoping to better understand what the experience is like living informally outside the United States. It was really exciting working with both the foundation and the university to plan the trip and to do the application process. So I think a lot of my excitement about informal housing and researching this was pretty nebulous, right? I knew a lot about it. I had an academic understanding of what it looked like to be person who was living in informal housing, but didn't have much more than just that academic notion. So through the process of putting together my application for the foundation, I learned a lot more. I had to do a lot more deep diving into what was happening around the world in different countries, and realizing that there is just a gamut. There is a whole wide range of what people are doing in terms of slum and informal settlement housing. So during the process, I was really lucky to be able to talk to a lot of experts. Princeton has a really well-rounded group of individuals from different countries who were able to give a lot of guidance both on what informal housing looked like in different countries and also like what the economies of those countries were like. So during the process of application, I was just learning a lot more and trying to figure out what, if I received funds, that trip would look like. And then once the rubber hit the road and I found out that I had received the award, then it was time to actually figure out which countries to go to, which was really challenging, but in an exciting way. I think I had something like 26 countries on my list before narrowing it down to about 7 or 8, one of which got switched around because of like global upheaval. But it was really exciting trying to figure out like, how do I create a very targeted subset of countries that are, sort of at like the farthest spectrum, so not providing any support to people, all the way to the most supportive, so providing like a lot of regularization. And then also just trying to figure out like, how is it going to operationalize the outcomes? So there are so many things that you could look at in terms of like what housing does to people's lives, right? Housing is so fundamental. It affects your health, it affects your voting patterns, your schooling, how safe you feel, like the amount of times you are interacting with police and things like that. So I was working with a lot of my advisors at Princeton to try to figure out like what the 3 outcome variables were that I was going to look at. So the things that I ended up choosing were income, so like how much access you had to credit, wealth, and whether or not regularization affected your economics. The second was sense of security, so the feelings that people had living there, of how safe they actually felt. And the last, I hadn't thought about beforehand, but then working with the advisors, actually political engagement, so like whether or not you were more or less likely to vote if your land had been regularized. So I spoke Spanish and a little bit of Portuguese. And a few of the countries that I went to, so Guatemala, Peru were both Spanish-speaking countries, and then Brazil was the other Latin American country, but obviously they speak Portuguese. And traveling to the global south, I had actually lived in Panama for a short while before college, so had some sense of what Guatemala would be like. Obviously, Guatemala and Panama are very different countries, but they're Central American, and so there are some common themes. Guatemala is one of the countries where there was no regularization. So the areas that I was visiting were in Guatemala City, and their informal communities are actually centered around the Guatemala City dump. And so people who are living in slum settlements there essentially move into the dump, and their entire life is based around the dump. So they are sort of building their houses out of things that they scavenge, and then they're also collecting and those scavenged items and selling them back into the formal market. So when I was in Guatemala, I was learning a little bit more about like the economy of that, and also what it looked like to just live within the dump, because obviously the dump is also sort of like a municipal item, right? Like the government is sort of monitoring it. And so people are living there under the guise of governmental control, but also living outside the spectrum of governmental control. So it's super interesting learning more about people living there, what brought them there, what it's like living there, some of the challenges. Living in abject poverty in places like Guatemala, and I actually lived in Nicaragua doing very similar work after I graduated from college. And I think in those cases, and I obviously can't speak for all people who are choosing to emigrate, but I actually, given my time in both those countries, think it is less likely that those who are living in abject poverty are doing any migration. A lot of people that I interfaced with who knew people who were able to come to the United States were people who actually had like surprisingly more means than we would expect. So they had enough to pay a coyote or somebody who could help them traverse that long travel. And often, many times, they had people to connect with once they got to the US. The people that I was interfacing with in the city trash dump and in Nicaragua, the Managua city trash dump, had almost nothing, right? So they're earning less than $1 a day. They're just trying to make ends meet and keep their family surviving. So the thought of uprooting themselves and being able to move to a different country, I think is just very far outside of people's mindsets. That obviously doesn't speak for everybody, but I just wasn't interacting with anybody who even thought about that. So the reason that I decided to go to Peru was because they had started to think about regularizing some land. So in Peru, I went to Lima, And while I was there, I was working with a small group of people who were advocating for more formal housing in Miraflores, which is right outside of Lima. It's sort of like a suburb of Lima. And so I was working with a small group of individuals there, and I met with one or two politicians and a professor or two. And so we talked a little bit about the regularization process in Peru. And, Lima is, I think, in sort of an interstitial space. It hadn't been given a lot of formal tenure, but it was being considered. And so the individuals there had a little bit more ownership and regularization than people who were living in Guatemala City, where there was absolutely none. And it was just pure. While I was spending time talking to people who were living in informal settlements, I think both in Peru and also in the rest of the countries that I visited, there is a very clear subset of individuals who are disadvantaged. It's sort of like in the United States, right? There are populations that have been historically marginalized, so blocked from high earning jobs, blocked from access to credit, blocked from wealth. And those individuals are consistently more likely to end up in informal housing. And so in Peru, it's a super multicultural place. The city of Lima itself is a large city with a lot of different backgrounds. And in the slums, I do think there is more likely to be a subset of indigenous individuals and people who are at sort of the bottom of. So Brazil, I went to because so many of the cities in Brazil are interacting with informal housing in really different ways. I was in both Rio and Sao Paulo when I was in Brazil. And Rio and Sao Paulo, Rio is one of I think the most recognizable senses of informal housing. We have all seen images of the favelas, so the areas that are mountainous right outside of the city, where there are a ton of informal dwellings. And Rio is actually really interesting. There are historic favelas there and the new favelas, and the historic favelas are actually very well integrated into the city. Many of them actually are sort of middle class favelas, which is normally not what we think of when we think of slum housing. But the favelas, so Morro de Favela, the parts that are right in the middle of the city, are a lot older and were developed at sort of the starting of Rio. And those have a lot more cachet, for lack of a better word, than those favelas that are outside the city. And so Rio, even within Brazil, Rio is very different than Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is a mega city, it's huge, it's increasing, and there just isn't enough housing to provide settlements for everybody that is moving there. And so as Sao Paulo has expanded, so has the informal housing. And so I went to Brazil in part because Rio and Sao Paulo, I think, are just very well known as megacities. And also Rio and Sao Paulo are both implementing really advanced, or at the time they were pretty advanced, regularization policies. So Sao Paulo was doing a little bit less than Rio, but Rio had just implemented Favela Bairro program, which was a land regularization policy that was trying to give people who are living in the favelas access to their land. And so it hadn't extended to the newer favelas, but for the older ones, they were starting to roll out this process. So being there was very different than being in either Peru or Guatemala. Guatemala, again, super unregularized, relatively new slum settlements, whereas Brazil had this very tiered approach to regularization and also just presented a very different history of informal settlement. So one of the things about informal housing is that by and large, you do not have any formal legal agreements between a landlord and a tenant. Oftentimes the informal settlements are just developed by somebody throwing down some corrugated metal onto a plot of land. And because there isn't a formal ownership structure, you're not necessarily actually having any tenant paying rent. Despite the informal practices, however, there are frequently people who take over plots of land and then recoup rents from individuals that are living on them, even though there is no formal landlord-tenant law. And so I think in some of the favelas, you would see that there were people who sort of said, this is my land. If you're going to squat on this land, you have to pay me. But because it's extrajudicial, there's no way for them to formally evict or, require that somebody pay rent. So I think a lot of it is sort of strongman based, it's a little bit more like the mafia in the US, for lack of a better comparison, where people are just requiring that their rent's extracted. That wasn't true in all of the favelas. In some of them, people just didn't pay anybody, but there were some instances where people had to pay these. One of the unfortunate things I learned from doing my research was that I didn't see or witness a ton of instances where having an address necessarily improved somebody's access to income or wealth. A lot of people were still able to earn money and like make money, even though they were living in informal settlements. I think especially in cities that are expanding like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, there is almost an expectation that people might not have a formal address. In terms of access to banking, I think a lot of the academic literature suggests that if somebody has access to or ownership over their land, they will be able to use that as sort of like a wealth provider, a wealth generator, or a way to use or obtain credit. One of the things that I was finding as I spoke to people and met with nonprofit groups and government agencies in these cities was that many times, especially in places like Brazil, where the informal regions were pretty historic and well known, was even if you had an address, so even if the city had come in, given you ownership and given you an address, banks were unwilling to lend to you because they knew where you were living. Having an address, you could still map it and say, well, this is still in one of the favelas, and so we don't really think that this is a credit-worthy Africa. And I was specifically looking at Johannesburg, and within Johannesburg, an area called Soweto. And Soweto had undergone a process of formalization a few years before I visited. And so I was learning a little bit more about how they were formalizing land holdings. And a lot of the Soweto process was actually not countrywide, but it was locally led. So some of the local organizations had been advocating to upgrade and make some of the informal housing more formal. And so it was really interesting to see in some of the other countries that I had been to, the formalization, for example, in Rio didn't necessarily include any upgrading of the structures themselves, but just bringing in some government roads, maybe trying to implement some sewage systems and other waste treatment, but like the houses were mostly there. In Soweto, a lot of this included like upgrading the houses and the homes themselves. So you saw some of the distinctions between the like informal houses, which were still corrugated metal and sort of put together randomly, and then the more formal houses, which were made out of brick and, you know, looked much like what we would think a standard brick house in the United States. South Africa, I think there are certainly comparisons that can be made between the apartheid South African like regime and some of the post-Civil War Jim Crow South. Housing is really interesting because it often reflects some of the political realities of what are going on. And so, you know, in the southern United States, you do see a lot of differences in terms of housing. So even now, there's a lot of micro segregation. So, you know, a city might not be wholly segregated in the way that a northeastern city might be, but there is a ton of this like within block segregation where like a white family might be living in a larger house and a black family is living in like a smaller, almost like an accessory dwelling unit. And so you see a lot of both proximity and distance, and you see like the structure of the society within the housing. And I think that was reflected in South Africa as well. I mean, Soweto, I think, is a really amazing example of like Black-led empowerment. And so Soweto, because it was so segregated, it was very separated from the rest of Joburg. And so it's like a very Black empowered area where I think they were trying to overthrow a lot of the vestiges of apartheid and using housing as one of the ways to empower the community. And so you can see in some ways apartheid there, but I think because it was so wholly segregated, it didn't seem as similar in a lot of ways to the American South, where racism exists and segregation is both like keeping people close and keeping people far. But because I was only in Soweto, I don't think I got to experience as much of the regime of apartheid and like the impacts of it that I would have been able to see if I saw more of Joe. When I went to India, I was located specifically in Mumbai. So looking mostly at Dharavi, one of the largest slums in the world. And it is huge, it's sprawling, it's really, really large. And I think as a result, while there are definitely pieces of like the marginalization that you would see like based on religion and caste, a lot of people are living in Dharavi. And in some ways, you know, so in contrast to Guatemala City, where it was a relatively small community that was living within this trash dump, Dharavi is essentially a city unto itself. You have a ton of people who are living there of a lot of different castes. And I would say like you could safely say it's probably just lower caste individuals. I doubt that you have like the highest caste people living in any of those informal communities. But you also have a lot of people who are recent immigrants or migrants to Mumbai, people who are moving out of rural areas and trying to access jobs. Because so much of my work focused on what the actual policy was in terms of land regularization, I didn't interview like a ton of people that were living in Dharavi. So I don't think I can necessarily effectively speak to that. I would say like just based on social structure generally, it probably is most likely that those who are most marginalized live within those communities. I ended up going to Thailand because Bangkok had, like a number of the other cities that I visited, Bangkok is a rapidly expanding city. And it's a city where a lot of things are very formalized. So Bangkok has, for example, an amazing transit system, a lot of really beautiful new build buildings, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of technology. And yet along the rivers and the deltas, there are a number of informal settlements that are growing up. And so the reason that I decided to go to Thailand is because it presented a very different structure in terms of the informal housing than the other areas that I was going to. So like I said, Dharavi in India was very much like a city unto itself. It was large, it was sprawling, it was also concentrated. Soweto, a small community in of itself, Rio and Sao Paulo, sort of like these different informal settlements all throughout the city. In Guatemala, this very small community. And so both the structure of it was interesting, and then they were starting to consider some formalization policies that had not yet been implemented. So it was a good example for me to go in and be able to see like what is the construction of a potential formalization. So everybody, and when I went to Hong Kong, everybody that I met with was generally non-governmental. So in a lot of the other cities that I went to, I was able to access some people who are working in government to get a better sense of what they were doing on the ground. In Hong Kong, I was not able to get in touch with anybody from the government. And so, don't know if this is just my N of one example, but it did seem like government was held at a bit more of a distance, that it would be much harder to infiltrate those ranks and to get a better sense of what they're doing. Business people also did not interact with many business people. I was mostly working with like organizations who were doing formalization and some services on the ground. And everybody, I mean, one of the nice things about this grant and this opportunity with the Circumnavigators Foundation is that you're able to see that despite vast differences in histories, people by and large are very similar in that they are kind and welcoming and often have the best interest of the communities that they're working with at heart. And so I didn't find Hong Kong to be terribly different than any other country in that way, though it was one of the few countries where I wasn't able to get any access to any government officials. And so the trip was amazing and it was eye-opening, but it was also sometimes very lonely. Being 19 or 20, I anyway, was used to spending like almost 24 hours of my day with friends prior to this. And so suddenly you are embarking on this trip where you are leaving cities and entering cities by yourself. You are forging new connections and meeting new people. And so sometimes that meant that days were filled meeting new people if I was staying in a hostel or interviewing people, but it also meant that there were a lot of lonely airport days, a lot of lonely nights, and a lot of showing up to cities at night, which for me anyway, felt very lonely. And I think about a month into the trip, I realized, oh, wow, I am only about a third of the way done with this. This is like running a marathon and getting to mile 12. And that can be overwhelming. Luckily, I had friends and family who came to visit me at a few different stops. So my mother came out to visit me when I was in India. And then when I was in Thailand, I had friends who were also living in Bangkok at the time. And so I was able to interface with a few people at the end of the trip, which I think really took the edge off of the loneliness. The circumnavigatorship was amazing in terms of I learned so much and found out so many things, and also just had an amazing time with people that I met. I think in every single city that I went to, I had at least one night where either people that I was interviewing or people that I met just having lunch someplace wanted to go out with me. And so we would like spend the night, drinking beers or having snacks or spending time on the beach, depending on where I was. And those were such fun nights. I feel like I learned so much about people. One of the more memorable experiences was I was there was one cafe that I really liked in Miraflores. And so after like a long day of interviewing, I would go to the cafe, and there was a skate park right outside. And I sat down, and I think I was like writing in a journal or something. And somebody approached me, and we started talking, and it was 2008. So it was when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were both in the Democratic primary. And the person who approached me didn't realize that it was the Democratic primary, but they wanted to know more about Barack Obama. And so we just had like a really lovely 2-hour conversation about politics in Lima and politics in the United States, and talking a lot about Obama, Clinton, and like what the differences were. And that was such a fun evening, and like a really great way to learn more about how people think about local government. I was flying from Rio to Joburg. It was a night flight, and I got on the flight, and it was cool. It was a 3-person row, and there were 2 people that were pretty young on either side of me. So we chatted for a while, and then I fell asleep because it was nighttime. And when I woke up, they were holding hands like on top of me. Like my body was in the middle of them holding hands. And I was like, oh, what? So, and they told me that they had chatted and really hit it off. So I offered to move and let them sit next to each other, and they didn't take me up on it. Like they didn't want to sit next to each other. So they continued to hold hands over me for the entirety of the flight. And it was like pretty early in terms of like smartphones. So we like exchanged emails, and they added me on Facebook. And then we didn't really stay in touch. You know, I would like see their updates. But then a few years ago, they got married, and they invited me to the wedding on Facebook. I don't think it was a real invite. Like I turned them down. I think if I had gone, they would have been weirded out. But it was a very nice gesture, and also like a great memory. Getting back from the trip, I think, was very difficult, in part because I was so used to living in a very different way. I was used to, you know, it's interesting, I was studying housing, and in some ways throughout the last 3 months, I had sort of been unhoused myself, you know, didn't have like a stable address and was changing all the time. And so coming back and just being in one place, I think I did feel a little bit of culture shock, both in terms of just the boredom. And that doesn't feel that deep, but you know, I had been like interviewing 3 or 4 new people every single day, or you know, experiencing something new every single day for about 3.5, 4 months, and then all of a sudden you're back home and you're not doing that. And I think it was also a little difficult to get used to living back in the States. The States is just such a place of abundance, in every sense of the word. The grocery stores are overflowing with 18 different types of cereal. People have so much money and so many things. And I think having spent the last 3 months interfacing primarily with people who didn't even have running water, it's just a lot to sort of work with. So the club required that we give a presentation. And so preparing it was actually really great, because part of why Princeton encourages people to go is because it is also a way to get information and data for your senior thesis if you choose to do one. Well, I guess you have to do one. At Princeton, you have to do a senior thesis. You don't have to do the topic that you did for the Circumnavigators Foundation, but I did. And so a lot of the preparation for the report was actually great, because it provided the literature review and a lot of the background for my senior thesis. So it was really lovely getting to go back through all of my notes and the pictures that I had taken, get reacquainted. And it also provided an opportunity to put a lot of that in contrast with the other places. So, you know, looking at Guatemala and the notes that I had taken from there, you realize how different India's structure is for governing, and just how different all of that is. And so it was a really nice way to reflect on the trip, and to also better incorporate and digest the information that I had taken in. And then presenting it was a really great experience. You know, you see these people a year before, they're interviewing you. It's very scary. You're very nervous. You really want the grant. You have no idea if you're going to get it. And so you're putting your best foot forward. And then afterwards, when I came back and met with them, it almost felt like I was a member of the club. You know, you feel like, oh, our trips were very different, but we have both spent time exploring a question, meeting new people, being unhoused for a while. And that's a really cool connection, especially when you're 19 and some of the other people are in their 60s or 70s, maybe even their 80s. It's a way to bridge and close time in some ways. The trip was really informative in teaching me a lot more about the nuances of informal settlements. And I think it also really hit home the idea that it is so difficult to govern. It is so difficult to make policy that actually has the intended impacts that you want. So especially in places where some of the formalization processes were a little bit better advanced, there were a lot of unexpected and I think unintended consequences of those. So for example, India had been implementing a regularization process where it was trying to give people access to formal homes. And I don't think one of the things that they intended was for people to like sell that home and move out immediately and return back to Dharavi. But in many cases, that was what was happening. And so the government was like struggling to try to figure out how to implement a policy so that people couldn't do that. But when you think about it, that makes the most sense for somebody who is living in that house. Like, yes, they have this formal home, but you could sell it for something like, thousands of dollars, which you need to still get by. If you're not earning enough to feed your family, take this one-time cash surplus or influx. And so I think the trip as in general made me realize that it is, one, very, very difficult to make policy, especially as an outsider. And the second thing that I think it taught me is it's just impossible to talk about informal settlements. Even doing this interview, it's very strange because I feel like I'm not comfortable saying informal settlements anymore because they're all so different. Informal settlement basically just means informal, not within the system, but there's so many different ways to be outside of the system. The final year at Princeton was great. It was great in part because I felt like I had such an expanded view of the world. I felt much more worldly. I felt like I was much more comfortable with myself, spending time alone, initiating things. It was also great because it had given me so much fodder for my senior thesis. So when I got back to Princeton, I hit the ground running and knew exactly what I wanted to look into. So I ended up narrowing my scope of focus from the Circumnavigators Foundation grant to just looking at the Favela Bairro program in Brazil, in Rio. And so Princeton actually was kind enough to fund another visit. And so I was able to add to that base of knowledge that I had built through the week or so in Brazil prior, and just explore that one project more deeply. So it was great because I felt more excited and invigorated as an individual, and then also had all of this great information that I could plow into a thesis. I do college interviews for Princeton sometimes. And when people ask for what I enjoyed most about college, I have to mention this grant because it's transformative. You have the opportunity and the funds to go to so many different countries and just meet new people and explore things. So I would just say it's transformative. And if you have the opportunity, you shouldn't pass it up. So after I left Nicaragua, I took a Project 55 fellowship and I was working at the Rockefeller Foundation in New York City. I was working on 3 very wonderful teams. And so Rockefeller Foundation, it's a philanthropy. And so a lot of the work was grant giving. And so the 2 groups that I worked on that were grant giving were one on a global health initiative that was looking at national health insurance schemes. So better understanding like which countries have health insurance, how is it deployed, and what are the most successful facets of each country's welfare system or national health system. And then the other project that I was looking at or was working on was in the United States, and it was a transportation initiative. And so the goal of that initiative was to build a better transportation policy. In 2011, we were still hoping that there would be more than just a continuing resolution for the transportation bill. And so a lot of it was strategizing about who are the organizations and the individuals who would best be primed to help research and influence policy passage. And during both, I learned a ton. Global health insurance is very different than domestic transit, but learned so much about both. And then I was also working on an internal team that was doing resource ideas, like we're generating ideas based on local organizations on the ground in different countries. And so it was actually a really nice way to sort of pull on some of the research that I'd been doing with the Circumnavigators Foundation, right? Because you're both looking globally for everything and then also trying to apply really narrow solutions. So it's a really interesting mix of being both global and narrow. I got my doctorate in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And continuing this theme of housing, I think by the time I had gotten to graduate school and building a little bit on that notion that it's really hard to build policy as an outsider, I wanted to switch my focus back to the United States and back to a domestic context. And I think especially with the increases and homelessness in the United States, some of what we're seeing in other countries is not so dissimilar to what we're seeing in the United States these days. It's real in almost every city in the United States. People are like going unhoused all the time. And so a lot of the work that I was doing in Madison was trying to better understand like what does housing, homelessness, and like just the general change in housing mean for individuals. I'm also like a big map nerd. And so a lot of the stuff I was doing in Madison was like GIS based. And so I was trying to understand it. So when I lived in New York working at the Rockefeller Foundation, I lived on the Lower East Side of New York. I was living in a neighborhood that was like pretty historically low income, and there wasn't a grocery store anywhere. And then 2 or 3 years into my tenure there, a Whole Foods opened about 3 blocks away. And so the Lower East Side sort of had been a food desert in that there were really only bodegas. And then suddenly we're no longer a food desert, but it's a Whole Foods. So who can afford to shop there? None of my neighbors who were like first generation Chinese immigrants, many of whom were not earning a ton. And so that really posed an important question to me, which is like, what are the resources that are coming into cities and who are they accessible for? And so some of the things that I ended up figuring out or looking at were, after doing research and a lot of mapping, was this idea, and it wasn't my idea. I did not coin this phrase, but the idea of like resource mirages. So the idea that in like a lot of places like Brooklyn, LA, Columbus, Ohio, where I live now, there are resources that are coming into the cities, but by and large, they are economically and socially like not available to most of the people there. And so when we think about like resource deserts, especially food deserts, that isn't a terribly helpful frame because you're blocking out whole areas because there is a grocery store there, but like who can afford to shop there? And many of the people that you're targeting, you know, like can't shop there and can't access those resources. So we have to think like more broadly about what inclusion means. It's not just the presence of a store, it's people being able to go into it and feel comfortable there and also be able to afford things. So after I graduated from Princeton, I took a position at Nika Hope, which was a small nonprofit organization that was located in La Trideca, which is the trash dump of Managua. So it was very similar actually to the work that I had seen and done when I was in Guatemala City. It's a community, La Trideca was a community of about 150 200 people who are living in the dump, but are also using the dump as sort of their means of economics income. And so one of the things that I was doing a lot at La Trideca, it was a small nonprofit. And so there's a lot of things obviously to do, but was working with individuals on some economic upgrading. So trying to do some like job programs, outreach and fundraising, and also trying to work a little bit on like land formalization as well. So after graduating from my PhD program, my partner and I moved to Columbus, Ohio, and I took a position as the Director of Housing Policy at the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. And so most people don't know, but every state has a housing finance agency. And the Housing Finance Agency, you know, it varies based on the state, but by and large, they're doing rental assistance through things like the low-income housing tax credit program. Oftentimes they're the individuals who are doing like the home funds or other sort of development of like rental properties. Usually not the management of those, but the development, the funding, things like that. They also are frequently in charge of programs like 811 or 211, programs that are meant to serve individuals who have lower incomes. And they also frequently are encouraging homeownership for low to moderate income individuals through like low interest rate loans and down payment assistance. And so a lot of the work that I was doing at OFA was looking at how to inform those programs through data, how to measure their effectiveness through data, and then also just working with a number of other state agencies to address and ask questions about a lot of housing. So in Ohio, that is anything from like eviction to homelessness, houselessness, better understanding the connection between substance abuse and incarceration and people who are living unhoused. And so spending a lot of time doing that. I learned so much. I think, you know, going back to the Circumnavigators Foundation, this was an opportunity to really look local. So, you know, just looking at one state and then realizing that like, that is still really global. Like Ohio is basically like 6 states in one. And so even making statewide policy is really challenging. Housing is so fundamental. And I think that has been true whether or not I was in Brazil or Hong Kong or Southeastern Ohio. If for some reason you don't have access to a house, if you've been evicted, if you've been foreclosed, if there is no housing for you to move into, if it's unaffordable, there are so many ways in which your life is impacted. And I think you just see that all the time. I saw it with kids. You don't have the same school to go to, so your learning is interrupted. You're not in a safe place at night, so you're not sleeping well. You're outside a lot more, and so you're sick a lot. And those are just like the small ways in which it can affect you. And so I think that has just been like such a consistent message that housing is fundamental. So I just joined the Urban Institute in September of 2021. And here I am working on a number of housing related projects, including the Housing Matters Project, which is generally just trying to connect housing to all of those other things that we know it is connected to, but people in those silos might not know it. So for example, housing and climate, so interrelated. Like in California, for example, the stress of people wanting to move to California means that people are building houses in places where maybe they shouldn't build houses. And that is disrupting the climate, but those people are also more likely to be subjected to climate change. If you live in an older property, it's probably not weatherized, probably not climate proof, probably not using energy efficiency standards, but that also drives up your utility bills. And so there is like a lot of space for people who work on climate and housing to interact. And so one of the things we're trying to do is just get that message out there to those stakeholders who might normally be siloed. At my job right now, the thing I am most proud of is having, it's not even something I'm doing right now. It's just having the opportunity to think more broadly about housing and what we really need in this country to build a more comprehensive, robust housing safety net. And then what I am most proud of in my career generally is not so much the work, but I just hope, and I don't know if I'm proud of this, but I hope that when I interact with people, I am not extractive, but I'm trying to humanize them and maybe give voice to experiences that individuals have. I think especially working on things like homelessness and eviction, you're working with people at a time at which things are really not good. It's awful and it's really hard. And I think there is a space where somebody could be really extractive. But I think that there is a way to build some of those voices together to hopefully make change. And I think housing is a space where it's really hard to make that change. But I hope that by building some of these collective voices, we're able to at least contribute to that change. I would like to see the world and every country in it be able to provide some sort of stable, safe, adequate housing for everybody. I know that that's like a pipe dream, but it's something that I think would just be really wonderful, both in the States and also everywhere else. And so there are so many different ways that we could do this. We could change zoning, we could fund housing, we could cap rents, though I know economists don't like that. We could provide more rental supports. But I think the answer is right now, we need all of it. And we need to recognize that we are doing ourselves a disservice by not housing people. I learned so many life lessons from my circumnavigation. The first is we are so much more similar than we are different. And that isn't to negate any of the differences that people have, the experiences that they have, but humans are often friendly and warm and welcoming. And I found that to be true everywhere that I went. And it just makes me want to know all the people. The second life lesson is planning is really important, and it is good to always have phone numbers written down and to know what your bank account numbers are and to be prepared, and that will minimize stress and potential problems when traveling. And I think the last thing is just, so many of the things that are fundamental to you and I and everybody in our families here is fundamental to other people, other places, and so when we think a lot about the rest of the world, I think often we have an impetus to sort of other them and think about places as being very different, people being evil, bad, foreign, outgroup, and that is just, not the way that I see the world. I think after this trip, I felt very confirmed that, we are all very similar in what we need and what drives us. And while it might differ in a lot of ways, there's a lot of space there for us to all be the same. Going on the trip, I think I learned a lot about myself. One of the things is I am okay being alone, and I am a lot braver than I thought I was. I had always really wanted to spend a lot of time outside the country, and while I had in different ways, this was really the first time that I had spent so much time in so many different parts of the world. And it was great. I think I learned that the world is much more accommodating than you might think it is. I feel pretty comfortable now showing up anywhere and believing that as long as I'm respectful, I can find a place to be no matter where it is. And what else did I learn? Yeah, just that if you put yourself out there and you spend time just by yourself, you will probably make friends. And that is, I think, a great lesson. Coming back, I think I felt much more comfortable like going out to dinner by myself and spending time solo. And I still really like doing that. Have family members or friends meet up with you. One, because it takes some of the edge off of the loneliness, but two, it also gives your friends or family member a wonderful reason to go to some place that they might not have otherwise. My mother, who grew up, was born and raised within 10 miles of where she lives now, and had only been outside of the country once, was able to come visit me in Mumbai. And what a wonderful thing to be able to share that experience with her, but also give her a reason to go to India. The second thing I think would be to think clearly about how you're dividing your time between the research and the not research. It's really important to answer your question and to get the data and to figure out, what you're looking at. But it's also really important to just sit back, relax, and have a beverage of any kind that you want and just chat with people who are staying in the hostel with you or who are living and working with you. I think my final thoughts are just food is really good everywhere. Beer is even better. And the world is just like a really great place to explore. I wish I had eaten more things, more places. I think that's like one of the biggest regrets that I have. I think I ate a lot, but I found like one or two restaurants that I really liked in every place, and I sort of went back. I wish I had eaten more weird stuff and done more weird things. The circumnavigation, I think, was a pivotal point in my life. And as a result, I think I am changed. And I carry that with me all the time. I think I have an appetite to explore. And I really want to better understand where people are coming from. Because I think I realized that you really, you can read as much as you want about something, but unless you get your feet wet, you don't really understand it. And I think that's something that I continually try to remind, or, I just know that, I feel that. And so even when interviewing people, I know that even what they're telling you isn't the totality of their perspective. I think this program would be a good fit for everybody. I wish that everybody had the opportunity to do this, because I think if you are excited about going to other countries and learning about a specific topic, it would be a great opportunity for you to act on it. But I also think it would be great for people who aren't that gung-ho, or who are feeling nervous or scared, or who haven't been able to travel outside of the United States, because I think those barriers would be pretty broken down by having this experience. I think you would realize that it's a wonderful opportunity to get to know people from other places, and there's ways that you can build connections with people everywhere. Given that this is the 50th anniversary, I feel very lucky to be a part of that legacy. In some ways, I feel very different from the people who interviewed me and who might have gone before, but also very similar. I feel lucky to be part of this community, and I am really excited that this is an opportunity that keeps on giving. I'm really happy that it's a foundation that it is not just a few students who are able to experience this, but that we might be able to pass that forward. And who knows, maybe I will one day be a 60-year-old who gets to tell people about my trip in the early 2000s. And yeah, it just is a great legacy to be a part of.